Chapter 53. Really Time to Go. Summary. Explanations are made and final goodbyes are had. It really is time to go.
What are you?
Someone who needs a nap, Izuku mumbled wearily under his breath. Luckily, his anxiety was keeping him semi-alert and aware, so he should be able to get through this without passing out. He didn't want to make a habit of passing out after emotionally draining conversations, but he'd take that over passing out in the middle of emotionally draining conversations. Izuku wrung his hands before speaking up. I'm sorry we put you in danger. We hadn't realized they'd found us, or we would have made sure this never happened. He couldn't look at all the judgmental eyes watching him, instead focusing his gaze on a smattering of rock shards by where he sat. If he squinted, they kinda looked like a dragon.
But who were those people?
Another voice from the crowd asks.
Why were they after you?
I recognize the insignia on the ships,
someone else shouted, a fearful lilt to their voice.
Those were traffickers! The Trellin! The biggest group in the universe!
Shocked gasps ran through the air. Looks like no one was expecting the random kids that had taken up residence in their town to be escaped victims of alien traffickers. Not that that's a normal thing to think. At least, Izuku doesn't think so. Conspiratorial whispers wound through the crowd, but Izuku didn't want to let it get too out of hand. Yes, he said, voice ringing clear. Okay, he could get through this. Those Drellin traffickers were after us. They took us from our planet, and we just want to go home. Hopefully, the emotion Izuku could feel radiating from the townsfolk was sympathy and not something else. He'd like to think that most of them were good people who didn't support the kidnapping and selling of children. But a cautious voice rang over the crowd. What was that? What are you? You took them down like it was nothing. The others were holding their own against trained mercenaries before. That happened. Now, this was the part Izuku was worried about. A familiar anxiety, one he thought he'd never have to deal with again, reared its head. He finally gets a quirk and stops having to reveal he's quirkless and face the backlash, only to get thrown into a situation where there's another thing for people to hate him for. The Trellin were only part of the reason they were avoiding anything to do with the government. The others didn't understand. They'd never lived through being quirkless. Given the fact Pyerpa and Fastel had stopped talking to them for days after they found out what they were, despite them being the only people they could talk to because they were locked in a cage on a trafficking ship, the discrimination Death Worlders faced was bound to be just as bad as the quirkless, if not even worse. Izuku saw Ochako getting ready to take over for him, but he needed to do this himself. He didn't want all the attention to be on her when things finally came to light. Well, Izuku started, trying to muster up his remaining brain power. Back on our home planet of Earth, we're training to be heroes, a profession similar to police, just with a heavier focus on fighting, particularly difficult threats.
But what was that with the lightning and the black things? And I swear I saw the blonde chef making explosions with nothing but his hands.
Izuku wrung his hands even harder. Well, the reason we're able to do things like that is Earth is also known as Terra. We're Terrans. Yep, just like he thought. Most of the crowd's first reaction at hearing what they were was some mix between what Izuku could only assume was fear, disgust, and confusion. A different combination of emotions than when he'd say he was quirkless, but a negative combination of emotions nonetheless. He couldn't help when his breathing picked up. He couldn't stand the thought of people they'd lived with for months turning on them for something they couldn't control. Not again. But then, something unexpected happens. From out of the crowd emerges a familiar face. 2 familiar faces, in fact. "Izuku!" rang out in Mr. Xiantuk's familiar drawl. "It doesn't matter what you are or where you come from. I'm proud of you lot for protecting the town." Ayelen chimed in next. "You said you were training to be heroes. Even after everything you went through, you didn't leave when you had the chance. You still protected us like heroes." It started off small and quiet at first, but soon most of the crowd was voicing their hesitant thanks. Almost everyone was still cautious, and some slunk off with scowls on their faces, but the ones that stayed didn't seem to hate them. A good handful even seemed more protective, grateful than before. That was new. Sure, Izuku knew, in theory, that people could try and get past their prejudice, especially if they knew someone from the group they're prejudiced against, but he'd never expected to experience it himself. When he was diagnosed, everyone left him except his mom, and even then, she treated him differently afterwards. But these people, maybe Izuku had just had bad people in his life before. His friends didn't care he used to be quirkless, and the 2 adults he really cared about here didn't mind that he was a Death Worlder. There would always be bad people who wouldn't see past what made them different, but it warmed a damaged corner of his soul to see that there were people who could. Mei and Denki rushed over to the main square after landing. It was a little rough, but the ship didn't explode, so Mei would count that as a win. Pyerpa and Fastel had opted to stay on the ship instead of going out into the crowds, still calming down from the sudden attack. Most of the town looked to be circled around where the fountain used to be. The pair expected to have to push their way through, but when they got close, a small, moth-like sentient noticed their approach. They quickly backed up in shock and fear? This movement caused a chain reaction of people spotting them and stepping back, seemingly on instinct, until there was a clear path through the crowd. Mei noticed as they walked that some of the sentients had guilty looks on their faces once they'd realized they'd moved. Mei wasn't quite sure what to make of that. She wasn't exactly a people person, but she knew something was off. They arrived at the center to find Izuku slumped over on the ground, as well as Katsuki and Ochako securing all of the Trellin attackers in a pile. The air was tense. The 2 by the Trellin had hard looks on their faces, and when Mei looked over to Izuku, she saw him blinking slowly, one eye closing and opening slightly before the other. Mei couldn't help but feel like this was her fault. The only reason the Trellin would have attacked the town was because of the message, the one the group had tasked her with preventing being sent. But she hadn't been good enough. Maybe the Trellin managed to uncorrupt the message. Maybe they saw the unreadable thing and decided it was worth checking out. Mei wasn't sure, but she knew it was her fault. She needed to be better.
"Mei! Denki!"
Ochako shouted, finally finished with the Trellin.
It's good to see you. Can one of you take Izuku back to the ship? He overused his quirk. We'll catch up with you in a sec. Just gotta make sure these guys don't get out before the police comes. A reluctant look crossed her face, and she glanced at, "Oh, was that Alan?" "For the last time," the kind woman said. "We can handle everything. You kids need to take care of yourselves." The defiance that had only been growing in Ochako's eyes left with a sigh. This is because of us. We should help, but if you won't let us, we need to at least make sure they get into the right people's hands. Plus, I have a few friendly questions I need to ask them.
Mei liked the dangerous look in Ochako's eyes.
Anyway, will one of you take Izuku?
Ah, the perfect way to get out of the crowd. The weird looks were creeping her out.
"I've got you, 10 million!"
Mei cheered, getting under Izuku's arm to help him stand. She got a quiet grumble in response. The two of them stumbled out onto the barren street, dust still wafting through the air. Broken glass sparkled in the streets, and doors hung off their hinges. Just another reminder that she needed to get better. She needed to spend more time learning everything there is about space tech. She wouldn't let this happen ever again. It didn't take long for the authorities to come and deal with the criminals. The teens left into the chaotic streets just before the cops arrived. Well, they wanted to help. They really should leave. Plus, they didn't have time to deal with bureaucracy. Misters Yuntuk and Alan followed close after them, trusting a close friend of Alan's to take charge until the Trellin get taken into custody. The 10 of them gathered outside the ship. Izuku had managed to stay awake, not wanting to miss out on seeing the adults one last time before they left. This goodbye wasn't much different from the other one they had less than an hour ago. Only now, they were leaving with everything out there. No uncomfortable truths hidden in fear of rejection. They cherished one last embrace, bodies tired from fighting, and adrenaline collapsing into each other's warmth. Misters Yuntuk complimented them on their skills with weapons, really praising Mina for how far she'd come, causing her pink skin to deepen into a scarlet flush. But they couldn't stay, and once again, it was time to go. Already exhausted from the events of the morning, the 8 of them boarded the ship and looked out at the town for what truly would be the last time. They rose into the sky before breaching the inky black sea of space. The planet looks the same as it did when they arrived, a planet so similar yet so different from Earth. Cotton candy clouds cradle the small planet in their soft embrace. Dense, pinky-green forests stretch across its landlocked continents, only a few abyssal bodies of water spattered like paint across canvas. The only difference was, as time went on, the comforting orb grew smaller, until all that lay behind them was inky blackness, and all that lay ahead was the journey to come.